Hello and welcome to the Avatar's Voice, a show where I talk with a different person each episode about virtual worlds. On today's episode, we hear from Allison James, also known online as Mangrovejane, or just Groves for short. Groves has been in the virtual world of Second Life for 2 years, since August of 2016. She's an artist who makes work both in and outside of Second Life using a variety of media, from sculpture, painting, and printmaking to digital photography and video installation, some of which was featured earlier this year in an exhibition called Perceptions of Reality at Queensland College of Art in South Bank, Australia. Prior to beginning a Master of Art in Visual Arts, Groves obtained a Bachelor of Education majoring in English, Art and Science, and a Bachelor of Science majoring in Australian Environmental Studies with a focus on plant and animal diversity and on mangrove forests in particular, hence her name. For 5 years, she also ran a nonprofit agency centered around environmental entertainment and ran a business doing environmental education for children, young people, and their caretakers. Hi Groves, thanks so much for being here.
Hi Mojin, thanks for having me.
So first off, you mentioned in an interview that you did with Kaisa Lilyhook on New World Notes back in February that you initially discovered Second Life through reading some academic papers about it?
I did. I was reading academic papers about the art of Second Life of all things, and I was following some leads on an artist whose name I can't remember at the moment. Dan Coyote, that was his name. He was an incredible inspiration of mine for a really long time, and I think he gave a real voice to digital art. And from that original article about Dan Coyote's artworks he did in Second Life, I also found Bryn O. She is incredible, and the way she tells a narrative really inspires and informs a lot of what I do as well. I love the way she winds a narrative in so simply. So yeah, there's quite a lot of academic articles out there, interesting enough.
I remember you also said in that same interview that your first 5 days in Second Life were actually a little traumatic.
They definitely were. They were quite the learning curve, actually. There were a few things that I'd learnt over those 5 days. The first one was that I have an incredible tendency towards stubbornness. I was telling you earlier that jumping in any online world is my absolute disability. I just can't seem to do it properly. I constantly miss the target. I would be really terrible at parkour in any world. But at the very beginning of Second Life, when you first log in and you create character, they take you through the introductory tutorial bit where you learn to walk and you learn to jump. And there's this series of 3 jumps that you do. And I had to do that 63 times. 63 times to get through it. It was a little bit crazy. At about 25, I was so stubborn and I was just getting through that. I wasn't leaving until I actually got through that. And I remember finally getting it, running out into Newbie Island and just going, I've had enough. I've had enough of this world, had enough of this life. I'm logging out right now. And then, of course, I came back the next day and, started searching around. But I also found out that it's a very different experience to a lot of online worlds in that there's no sense of achievement other than what you have for yourself. It's like life. If you don't have a goal set for yourself, you find yourself meandering aimlessly, wondering what you're going to do. You almost have an existential crisis. I had an existential crisis in my first week in Second Life. I should have done a blog post called that.
It's true, though. It is very different in many ways. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people outside of Second Life don't always understand, even if, or sometimes especially if, they have experience with MMOs like World of Warcraft, which I know you and I have both played. I mean, it's that whole dichotomy of multiplayer game versus virtual world, the so-called theme park versus sandbox distinction. And in Second Life and in other open-ended worlds where it's more about socializing and creating your own content and so on, there really isn't any set goal. There are no quests, no monsters to fight, and no achievements as you set to unlock. And because of that, you do kind of have to decide what the world is going to be to you.
That's right, yeah. And it's interesting too. I mean, we're going to have to breach this topic at some point, but the whole sex and SL thing, it is a constant thing that comes up to me with other people outside of the world, and they talk about it all the time. If you mention Second Life to people, they immediately relate it back to the press it got, the sexual press it got, of course. And I get asked a lot, are you doing anything? Like, well, no, that isn't exactly what I'm there for. And once again, it's like life. If you choose not to go there, you don't have to. You know, there are lots of places in the city that I don't go to because I don't necessarily want to go to brothels. You know what I mean? It's just an interesting thing that people assume that if you're in an online world that that's what it's about. But it's not. It's not that for everyone. Just as much as it's not about disability for everyone that's in the world as well. It's more about ability and what we can do rather than what we can't do.
Very well said. And it's like the internet itself, of course. I mean, no one at this point, thankfully, says, oh, what is the internet good for? All you can do there is go look at porn. It's understood that there are communities online of all kinds, all sorts of different resources and activities and interests, but obviously virtual worlds and Second Life in particular aren't there yet, where people can see it as not being this homogenous, monolithic thing.
That's right. And the world is so rich, and I did not expect that. I had such a different perception in those first 5 days than I do now. And I think it takes a lot to get a different perception of the world. You have to fight through a lot to get to this place where I'm at now, where I'm very fond of it. You know, like you grow to really love the world because you start to build a home, for instance. Like that was one of the turning points for me when I bought my first piece of land on mainland, of course. And I bought a place out in the snow because it's the furthest thing away from what I have in my real life. In my real life, I live in subtropical Queensland and it never snows here and I love the snow so much. So I figured in my second life, where would I live? Out in the snow. All right. So I went and bought a place out in mainland and that was incredible. Just trying to find a piece of land that I really like and then wanting to buy it. The second piece of land I bought was actually bought at auction and that was hard in itself. And I can remember waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning just to check the auction because it was closing really soon. And I wanted to get it in that last 15 minutes just to make sure I got that piece of property. And I think it's those struggles almost that make you more fond of the place that you're in. It gives you a sense of place and it gives you that feeling of home. And when you build your house on that piece of land and you put the things that are meaningful to you in there, you start to get more attached to that place. And then when you reach out and you start to talk to people, there's another turning point, I think, when you find that first friend and you find people that you connect with and click with. That becomes a big thing.
It does, and I'm glad you brought up the idea of home, too, because that's an interesting concept I think about a lot, this idea of shelter and having a space of your own, and what that means in a virtual world like Second Life, and also to look at the kinds of homes that people choose to have here.
The home is almost the embodiment of the person in a place where you have nobody. You could have any house you wanted, you know, like I could live in an igloo if I wanted to. But it's fascinating how we go back to the things that we know. You know, when I built houses, I built very ordinary houses, just like any ones you would find in any suburb. Even now I live in a big log cabin type house. I just find it incredibly fascinating how people choose to express themselves in their digital reality.
That actually segues very nicely into another question I was going to ask you related to self-expression in virtual worlds, especially since I know that you've thought about this a lot and you even made that video, Hello Avatar, about these issues. What does your avatar mean to you? Like, how would you describe the relationship that you have with her?
It's interesting because over time that avatar has become me. In the Hello Avatar video, I talked to Alicia Chanel about this. It says that she is still her in the online world and that avatar is her. And for me, it's the same thing. My avatar is me. In her day-to-day life, she will go around wearing jeans and t-shirts because that's what I wear in my day-to-day life. She's got glasses on. She's got blue hair. She's perpetually got messy hair. She's certainly not supermodel material in Second Life. She's even short, apparently. I did not realize that that would be a big thing either. But I found it interesting that through my artwork, she is morphing into a different character herself. And she's morphing into a character that used to come up a lot throughout my artwork that I used to call she. And she was, once again, the embodiment of me. And she was the things that I couldn't say, couldn't verbalize myself. So she would do things, or she would be very expressive with her body, and she was very naive. Every time I drew her or painted her, she was quite childlike. And the she that she is becoming is quite a powerful character. She's actually turning into a superhero / supervillain of all things. And it's interesting, I think, that sense of empowerment almost, that she is feeling more empowered as an embodiment of myself. And maybe she's feeling that way because, it's obviously because I feel that way, but it's finally expressing what I need to express through a digital reality.
Yeah, it's like the world gives you that permission almost, or that ability to express yourself in new ways that you might not have been able to before. Something you said also made me think of this. There's a term from transhumanism called morphological freedom, which is this idea that there should be a pluralism of forms, you should have ownership over your body and the right to modify yourself through various means. And in some ways, a world like Second Life, where, though you do see a lot of fairly standard human avatars, you also find communities where there are people who express and embody themselves very differently. Like, I'm a furry, I'm a fox in Second Life, and there's a huge community of furries. There's all sorts of different ways to present. And in a way, that's basically that concept of morphological freedom and ownership over your form, just in a virtual environment.
And yet, even with that morphological freedom, we are still ourselves. We still have our own faults and failings, and our prejudices, avatar prejudices. Another interesting thing that I find fascinating, that there can be prejudices in an online world where you can be anybody that you want to be, and it shouldn't matter at all. So why does it? The amount of times I have logged into, I'm going to say this, Second Life Facebook friends, and there's a fight going on about the fact that someone doesn't look normal, or someone's disproportionate. Why should that bother you? Real anger about it, not just, having a bit of a giggle because someone's disproportionate, but anger because they are. Where does that come from? And why does it bother people so much that someone looks different to them, or that they would choose to look different to them? It's interesting too, because Second Life is, it's an online world where you'd think people would communicate with one another within that online world, but most of the communication happens outside the world. Like when you go to an event, but nobody's really talking. You don't realize that they may be talking to someone in an IM, for instance, because you don't see that. They just seem to be standing there silently. For a long time, I can remember just observing that and wondering why they didn't talk to one another. And it wasn't until I started reaching out through social media, like Twitter, for instance. Twitter was the first one that I reached out on because it was one that I knew. Facebook was another one. And then you find other places that people lurk in almost, like now I have that whole thing. I have a post-it note on my computer whenever I do a blog post or a photo, for instance. It says, have you posted to Flickr, Facebook, Twitter, Plurk, Asnas, and Discord? So all the different ones that Second Life people hang out that are not of the world, because people don't see it in the world either unless you advertise it outside of the world. Exactly. Fascinating. It's not a closed system at all. It is very much a very open system. Why did it evolve that way? I don't understand why it evolved to become more out of the world than in, more outward looking with communication than inward looking. It's an interesting separation.
It is, and it's funny. What you just described mirrors my own experience in many ways, because I don't think I had a real appreciation for the magnitude or the scope of Second Life, and a real awareness of all its possibilities until I joined Twitter, 9 years after I first came in World, and I suddenly started seeing all these amazing residents, you included, who I might have never known. I might never have seen their work or heard about the places and events and creations they spoke about, or been a part of their communities, however tangentially, had I not found them first through social media, via these channels that, as you said, are external to the world. It sometimes makes me wonder how much I may have missed all those years that Second Life's been around, just by things not crossing my radar.
It's incredible to see the history and the journey it's taken, because I've come in 14 years in. And when you come into a world that is so already evolved, it's a very different feeling to coming into a world that has just started. And that's like the difference between Life and Sansa. Sansa has just started at the moment, and it has incredible potential, but I think it will always be disjointed. I don't think it's going to have that same feeling of community and connection in a lot of ways, because everything's separate, like you do walk into people's worlds. And I met the most incredible guy. Alicia and I were both in there, and he was showing us his world, and he'd built an amazing place. But it was like walking into a bubble, and then you walk out again and you go, oh, that was a nice place to visit, but you don't want to live there. And that's part of the reason why I love mainland and why I will probably never move away. Even though I do rent a homestead now, mainly for work purposes, I prefer my home to be separate to where I work. And my home is on mainland. It feels like, when you walk around the madness of mainland, it feels like a community because you can walk through it. There's no break in between it. I mean, yeah, you might go visit people's sims and you might see different things, but then you go back home again.
Since we're on this subject, talking about the value of having a seamless world in Second Life, at least on the mainland continents, and having that ability, as you said, to walk around, or as many people like to do, of course, to travel by some other mode of transport, Sansar, High Fidelity, ScienceBase, Janus VR, just to name a few examples, none of the major virtual world platforms that are in development right now that I'm aware of appear to have that same design that Second Life has. There's no mainland equivalent, that is, in any of them as far as I can tell. And I'm curious why you think that is. Like for the companies making these new social VR and virtual world platforms, why is it that they seem to be doing away entirely with that idea of a seamless world?
I think it's probably more easily profitable the way that they're doing it. I think at the end of the day, it comes back to the idea of how can we monetize each thing. And I think the private experience is easier to monetize than a whole world almost. Like when you have a whole world, you have to give people somewhere to go. It has to be almost like World of Warcraft, even though this isn't about that, but World of Warcraft, there are places to go, there are things to do. It drives you constantly to exploring different places.
Yeah.
Mainland, as it is now, there are lots of places to go. There's lots of things to see. You constantly want to move around and explore what is there. However, it took a long time to get there, to be the way it is now. It's taken 14 years of development for that world to be as beautifully mad as it is. And I think that the quickest way to get a virtual world up off the ground is to do these private experiences like that. But then you lose that sense of a whole world, as in a world that is in an entirety, like that map. The idea of the map, like for World of Warcraft and Skyrim and a whole variety of places, when you look at the map on Second Life and you can see it's a cohesive unit, that does something to you psychologically. It makes you think, oh, okay, this is all one place, all one thing, and we are all in this place together. Whereas you don't have that same thing for Sansar. You don't have that same thing for High Fidelity. They talk about the Sansar Atlas, but it's just a listing. It's like a destination guide almost. An atlas is a map. It's a book of maps, in fact, of one world. But the Sansar Atlas isn't a map. It's just a whole lot of destinations that you go to for holidays.
Visiting without living.
Yeah, visiting without living. There are some people who may want to live there, but I feel like it's a really lonely place to live. I have had a creator's place for a while now, but you're just living there by yourself. It's a very lonely place to live and build. Whereas Second Life, when I started building there, I was constantly in build brewery or public sandboxes, making stuff and talking to people and having them teach me things.
That actually reminds me of another question I wanted to ask you. Besides the push towards self-contained experiences with these newer platforms like Sansar, there also seems to be a noticeable devaluing, I guess you might say, of text chat as a means of communication and a prioritization of voice chat. What's your take on that?
For a lot of people in online worlds, it's a matter of trust to actually voice chat with them. It's not something that you go to first. You first want to get to know them via text, and then you might, take the relationship to the next level and chat to them via voice. Even a friendship, though, it's sort of hard to transfer to a voice chat.
I know what you mean. It's like you sometimes have to renegotiate the relationship and figure out who that person is all over again. I have to say, my own opinion on this is to always have the option of either text or voice or both. I mean, the more ways to communicate, the better. To be honest, that's what sort of irritates me about a platform like High Fidelity, which still, as far as I know, does not have text chat built in. There are apparently free add-ons you can download from their marketplace, but that's assuming a new user would know it's available and can figure out how to download it. It's assuming that the people they would want to talk to have the add-on as well. I mean, the first time I tried High Fidelity's desktop client, the volunteer greeter in their welcome domain said hello, through voice of course, and asked me if I needed any help. And it took a while before I could even figure out how to respond. I was in a university's computer lab at the time and had to spend a few minutes getting the computer's microphone enabled, but then I wasn't sure if High Fidelity's voice chat was push to talk or which button. I eventually realized all I had to do was speak, and thankfully the guy could hear me, but if he hadn't, if there had been additional configuration involved, I believe the justification from High Fidelity's end for why they don't include text chat by default is that it's hard to create a way to communicate through text that works well for users both in VR and on desktop, and I understand that, but I still find it an odd reason to not have it there at all.
It is very odd. And, if you'd had text chat, you would have been able to ask, how do I turn this microphone on?
Exactly, yeah.
There has to be some sort of interface to begin with that teaches you things. And I think for a lot of people on online worlds, they don't necessarily want to talk. I didn't talk to anyone for about 6 months. It was 6 months before I actually reached out and talked to someone. And not because I jokingly tell people I'm very shy all the time now. I'm not very shy, but for a long time I was just trying to work out what I was doing.
Yeah, sometimes you just need to be by yourself for a while to get your bearings. And it's true, you said not everyone wants to talk, and that's the other thing that bothers me when platforms like High Fidelity remove text chat as an option. There's the trust issue with voice that you mentioned earlier, and there's also, some people may be deaf or hard of hearing, some people may not be able to speak, or someone might have social anxiety, and I've seen a number of Second Life people say this on Twitter and in World, that for them, communicating through text is fine. It's easier, there's less pressure, they can stop and consider, and that if they do find themselves in an ongoing voice conversation in a larger group, for instance, they can tend to freeze up. And it's like, how do you create a platform that makes such sweeping assumptions about people's willingness or even ability to use voice chat? I wanted to shift gears a little, though, and go back to something you said toward the very beginning of the interview. You were talking about art in Second Life and artists whose work inspires you, and we had talked off camera, so to speak, about this idea of conceptual spaces and the value of doing art installations in a virtual world, and I'm curious to hear more about that and about your own relationship to making and exhibiting art in a virtual world.
One of the things that I've really loved about installation art, both in the physical world and in the non-physical world, is that idea that you can invite someone into your mind. It really allows people to walk inside something. When I was doing the maquette for what will eventually become the basis of my master's, it was interesting to walk into a painting and to actually place something where it's placed in a painting, for instance. You get a very different feeling and a very different emotive response to it. I think that's the interesting thing about the installations in Second Life, in particular with people like Bryn. You get a really different emotive response walking through her spaces than you would in the physical world. You can't recreate those spaces in the physical world, but it feels very much like you are walking through a mindscape. And I think that's the very attractive thing about doing art in online worlds. And if you've ever used Tilt Brush, for instance, it is really addictive that it's all around you. VR is going to have incredible implications for the art world, just as Second Life has had incredible implications. The things that people can do and make, but you have to be able to get people in there to see it. And I think that is one of the prohibitive things that has happened with Second Life art. Even just, when we had the opening night for the exhibit, for instance, I had to take my computer in because the one question that I get all the time is, so, can you explain Second Life to me and what you do in there? Well, not really. I have great difficulty explaining it to people. You actually have to take them in there. And so I have my whole desktop set up for them to walk in my shoes, and I will have my avatar there, and she starts off at home, for instance, and they can see what my home looks like in the Second Life world, and then I will let them walk through that installation. And once again, the feeling that they get is different, and that it evokes a different feeling to just looking at a painting or looking at a drawing. It's a very different embodiment of a feeling. Because once they take over an avatar, they become part of that.
Do you feel weird watching them control your avatar?
Yeah, I do. But at the same time, it's almost a very giving and trusting thing. And that becomes a part of the artwork too, to be so open to people and say, this is my online life. This is who I am. Would you like to be a part of me? And to give of yourself and to let somebody take control can be a really difficult experience. It's like, what will you do? If I let you have control of me, what will you do? What do you want to do? And I wonder with the avatar, if you let people do whatever they want to do with your avatar's body, what will they do? What if the person controlling my avatar decides to take off all my clothes and go streaking around? Funnily enough, you still get that same sense of embarrassment. You know, like the amount of times I've accidentally taken a piece of clothing off. I walked out the other day even, and I was at some sort of event, you know, a shopping event. 10 minutes I stood there without pants on. I think I'd accidentally worn something rather than added it. And you know how that sort of strips you
exactly.
of whatever was on that particular point? And it just happened to be my pants. When I realized that I'd been walking around this event without pants on, I was incredibly embarrassed. Even though it's just pixels, that embodiment still gives you a physical reaction. So if someone else takes over my avatar and they make me do things that I wouldn't normally do, how will that make me feel?
Yeah, avatar embodiment is a powerful thing. I'm looking at the clock here, by the way, and I know you have to get going in a minute. One last thing I wanted to touch on. Given that the vast majority of what you find in Second Life is made by other users, it's amazing to see how people will often come up with things that you wouldn't think was even possible, you know, that tricks you, in a good way, into believing the platform can do things that it can't. You and I were chatting recently about features we wish Linden Lab would add to Second Life, like reflections, so we could have real mirrors and other truly reflective surfaces. But at Kaya Angel's Angel Manor Estate, for example, the floor in the main lobby appears at first glance as though it is actually reflective. If you move the camera downward, you can see that he's basically made an upside-down copy of the entire room and set the floor to be slightly transparent. And because of that, it can't fake reflections on the fly, of course, so you won't see your own avatar reflected, but it still looks fantastic and is a very cool technique that I've seen used in several other places in world as well. Another great example that I love is a mirror that Havant Neox made in the Centaur's Hall. And the first time I saw this thing, I was initially convinced it was a mirror. What he'd done was to have the mirror object itself on the wall, somewhat transparent and with a sort of aged glass texture on it. And then behind that mirror, he put a hollowed out hemisphere with a texture on its inside surface that he had made to look like the scene the mirror would have been reflecting. So depending on where you're viewing this mirror from, you see different parts of that texture essentially functioning like a real mirror would. And it's incredible to see how people are able to work within and around Second Life's limitations to create things like that.
People find a way. It's interesting too that Second Life inspires such creativity because you do have to work around everything. You know, like, what can I possibly do to break this or to make this work or, you know, like something interesting? And so you have to think creatively. You have to think out of the box. You have to think in a different way to be able to do anything in the world. It's one of the biggest frustrations, but also one of its greatest assets.
Yeah. And I mean, in fairness to Linden Lab, despite Second Life's ongoing technical quirks and idiosyncrasies, it has improved a ton over the years and is far more capable as a creative platform than it was in the beginning. We might not have real mirrors yet, but we do still have a tremendous amount of freedom, and I have to say, this is largely thanks to the creativity and imagination of its users, of course. I never go in world and feel like I've seen it all or done it all or even been it all. I mean, the world still always feels to me like it's full of possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. You can do anything that you want. Anything. Do anything and be anything you want. So what are you going to be and do today? And it frustrates me no end when people tell me that they're bored in world. And I'm like, why? Why are you so bored? There's not enough time in my day to do everything that I want to do. I mean, I'm not just shopping all the time.
Really? Groves, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you also to all of you listening out there, whenever and wherever you're listening from. If you want to find out more about Groves and her work, feel free to follow the links down below. Until next time, this was the Avatar's Voice, and this is Eric Mondrian logging out.